Hey there, this is Ari. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. With me now is Dr. Evian Gordon, who is an MD and a PhD and is a world-leading brain expert. He's the founder and chief medical officer of MyBrainSolutions, the world's first digital brain tracking and optimization platform. He has more than 30 years of experience in human brain research and is considered one of the originators in the field of integrative neuroscience. And he's authored more than 300 peer-reviewed publications. And he's a mutual friend of my good friend, John Assaraf, who introduced us. When I asked John, I said, hey, I really want to talk to somebody who's an expert in cognitive biases and how our brains work to process information, which I feel is right now amidst this pandemic, more important than ever to talk about and really understand. And John, without hesitation, said, Dr. Gordon is the man to talk to. So it's a pleasure to meet you. I've also read your book. I'm a big fan of your work. It's really nice to connect with you in person for the first time.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to meet you. John has spoken very highly of you, and I appreciate the connection.
Yeah. So first, to start us off, I would love for you to do kind of a big picture overview of your perception of what is going on right now with this pandemic from a cognitive, from a neuroscience, neurological perspective. What's going on in our brains as we're processing this pretty unprecedented event and unprecedented response to an event like this?
So yeah, Ari, I mean, the reality is that this is a classic brain hijack. And by that, I don't mean that in a simplistic sense. I mean that we all know that the basic organizational principle of the brain is safety. And here we have two threats to that safety. The first is physical, which we're all aware of, and it's a pretty toxic physical threat. And even I can tell you at my age, it's kind of, I've never seen anything quite like this. But then, of course, there is the uncertainty. And uncertainty is very challenging for the brain non-consciously. And I'll come to the differentiation, of course, that we all know, but how it's beginning to be unpacked in neuroscience. But in a sense, that uncertainty is compounding the physical threat. So that's a kind of perfect storm when you also add the fact that there's a third issue, is the uncertainty also hasn't got a good time limit. So you've got a lot of confluence of events here that are kind of what the brain is wired to check and magnify till it's safe. So it's not safe. And so the challenge is, what do we do with that? I just want to add one other context area about that. Like people love to use all these kind of words about, catastrophic and brain hijack. And I like to use those words too. But I do always see the brain, Ari, from its physiology. So you've got these, these 85 billion neurons, and you have these brainstem, superior and inferior colliculus, and really deep brainstem networks that are massive projections that readily, in a fifth of a second, we've got laboratories where we've literally tested this, like presented stimuli so rapidly that people can't actually consciously or not aware of them. And we see this amazing projection that happens in a fifth of a second that kind of primes the brain for an immediate response. I mean, the whole basis of, we call it non-conscious, because not unconscious, you're actually kind of quite aware of it. It's just you don't have words for it. So you have the physiology because you can sense that your brain has picked up a cue, a mismatch. We just see it as, in the brain, we just see it as the brain is matching and mismatching every fifth of a second. Is this safe? Or is this, should I approach this or avoid it? And so anyway, the point is that the magnitude of that physiological feed-forward projection can often be underestimated. It is just so real. And then at about half a second, we consciously try and rationalize it. So that reconciliation, that dance in a way, that balance between the non-conscious the brain seem to have evolved these non-conscious biases as kind of shortcuts for decision making. Is this safe? Is this safe? Is this safe? Is this safe? And then we've got obviously the networks we think we know so much more about, which is the rationalizations, the logical thinking, the kind of planning. That is much more detailed. That happens much more slowly. It starts at about half a second, but it goes on for tens of seconds in some cases as we perseverate and start finding optimal solutions all the time. The brain is essentially a timing device that is looking to find immediate solutions of what fits with our previous experience that is safe, and then what fits with our previous experience that's rewarding. And so when you deconstruct it into its inherent brain dynamics, it gets kind of fascinating as how serious this hijack really is. It's not a metaphor, it's for real. And it's happening every second in most people in some way.
Yeah. I want to try to maybe see if I can rephrase and summarize very briefly what you said there in my own words, and you tell me if I'm misrepresenting things. But here's my take on what's going on. So I think ideally we have some kind of heuristics. We have some kind of previous reference point of experience for going through something like that, whatever we're going through in the moment. And from there, then we can sort of calmly, rationally analyze the data, analyze the situation that we're dealing with, and then maybe arrive at greater and greater levels of certainty as the data warrants doing so. And what it seems right now is we don't have any heuristics for going through any sort of pandemic like this, going through lockdowns and social distancing and wearing masks and all these sorts of things. So there's no reference point in our brains for what to do in such a situation, or how to process information, or how to evaluate good information from bad information. And what most people, I think, are doing is sort of just making an instant snap judgment. Usually that happened right at the beginning about what's going on. And then from then on, sort of rationalizing why that is the correct thing. And all the torrent of information that's come at us since then is processed by our brains through confirmation bias, where we seek out, only the information that fits with our original snap judgment of the situation. Do you think that's a sort of accurate picture?
Yeah, no, that's a great summary. Just with one other caveat that I'd say from the physiology, Ari, and that is that in your description, your weighting, your tonality, the amount of time you spend talking about the rational piece was great. I mean, that's what we see. Mm-hmm. But what we see, I think, is the converse, where actually the majority of what's going on is non-conscious, intuitive, bias-based, because it is such a unique confluence, as you mentioned at the beginning. So I would just suggest that another way of looking at this is just the extent to which that bias process and the perseveration in that mode is kind of dominating, and it's not getting a lot of look in for the rational brain and the kind of systematic thinking and reframing short, medium, long term. It's much harder to do that when this extent, the preoccupation, the dominance of our non-conscious brain seems to be in play. So yeah, but that would be my only kind of sort of physiological kind of slight shift in the weighting. I'd say it's like mainly non-conscious that's dominating, that's winning the play at the moment.
I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought it up, which leads to, I guess, how should those two things be weighted? I mean, we obviously, our emotions and our instant sort of reflexive, emotionally charged reactions and intuitive reactions to things have a very clear evolutionary purpose. And, if you are walking down a trail and you see a snake-like shape, in your peripheral vision, it's wise to have that emotional reaction of fear and to back away from it. So these things can be, obviously important, life-saving, but the rational side, the logical side, the calmly evaluating evidence, the more intellectual, analytical side also very clearly has importance.
Yeah.
How should they be weighted? And I know that's a really complex question, but how should they be weighted in this circumstance that we're going through right now?
It is a complex question. I mean, it's the essence of the brain's conundrum in neuroscience. I mean, just in the same as physics, we're trying to reconcile, Newtonian physics, essentially macro physics, with micro quantum physics, and we have no idea how those two things align. And in a way, the brain is kind of analogous, in my mind anyway, that we have these kind of rational, clear, specialized neural networks that are there for logical processing words and sort of planning and systematized logic. And we know that that's real and that we can sort of deconstruct that. But analogous, not too analogous to microprocessing, because it's not really micro, the brain's doing this at a macro level. This rapid non-conscious biases is super underestimated, as we all know, but we are starting to deconstruct it. But the point is that it's about alignment. So to me, what I see whenever we deal with any problem across the spectrum, from mental health to well-being to peak performance, it's just like what you said. If you don't have a framework, well, it's hard. If you look at the difference between an expert and a novice, an expert has a framework, they have a model. So if you don't have a model of your brain of starting off with, what are my non-conscious biases? How well do I understand them? What are my conscious thinking traps? How well do I understand those? And what are my strengths? So now once you've got that framework, you can then start answering your question, which is, what is the weighting? So it is complex, but it's actually pretty simple too, that most people, because they don't have a good framework, they're like dilettantes, you know, they've got all these facts and they've got stuff they're trying to impress people all the time, and they've got stuff they're sprouting to themselves, and their confirmation bias is driving them. So they're scanning around on Google and finding little bits to paint by numbers to make it look and feel like they've got a grasp of what's going on. And it can be pretty persuasive because, you know, smart people remember stuff, so they can sort of nobble it together. But when we look at how effective, you know, we happen to oversee the world's biggest brain database on across the board on everything that moves pretty much. And when we look at the most effective brains, they don't do that. They're actually amazingly clear in the way that they are able to align their non-conscious biases and their ability to think through things and match them. You know, it's that same thing, Ari, like it's not what people say that matters as much as the intention, you know, their non-conscious cues, their voice tonality displays their authenticity, which is that whole deep, you know, area of non-conscious biases, which is the question that you've asked. So, in answer to your question, the weighting is first and foremost seems to be, when we look at effective brains, firstly, do you really understand your biases? Like, so by the way, the company that I work with is called Total Brain. And there we assess the brain, and including non-conscious biases, because that is critical. Like, for example, I know for myself, I was really fascinated to see what was my bias. What was my inherent basic bias? Is it anger? Is it fear? Is it sad? Is it disgust? Is it happy? And so not understanding that, you have no beginning of a framework. Then, you know, I often ask people, what are the top 10 biases that you know about even? And very, very few people can say, okay, these are my top 10 non-conscious biases that I'm even aware of. They'll go, oh, everybody knows about loss aversion bias. You know, we all know we hate losing stuff. Everybody knows about confirmation bias because it dominates so much of our lives, and it's so hard to count against that. But when you get beyond that and the other obvious simplistic ones like gender bias and racial bias, people are stuck. Like they go, yeah, like there's them, us bias, and there's, you know, but not the big ones, the ones that really matter, like your attentional bias. What do you really focus on? Your small number bias. Do you realize that there's a, that, you know, we don't, it's very, most people have never been taught or trained how to deal with randomness. So people who believe in a lot of la-la land stuff, it's because they don't have a good grasp on probability theory. So these are just very interesting dynamics. So in answer to your question, understanding our biases. And then lastly, Ari, when I say to people, how many biases do you think there are? Like non-conscious, well-established biases. And they go, oh, like 10. Well, they're actually over 100. And that's scary. I don't know if you've ever looked at that list, but I often look at it and I go, oh my goodness, this is really serious. Like I've been doing this for 30 years, Ari, and I'm still coming to terms just with confirmation bias. Mm-hmm. You know, I deal with some of the sharpest tools in the shed in the brain, and honestly, behind the scenes, some of them say to me, you know, this confirmation bias thing is a nightmare. I'm one of the world's leading, not me, people have said this to me. They're some of the best statisticians in the world. And they'll go, but I still have a confirmation bias. You know, I'll read something with a small sample size, but it'll be an effect that they found. That is what I believe in. I'll go, yep, there you go. Right. See, told you. And so that is then to reconcile that, Ari, with the rationality that we know we're all capable of. But I believe that if it's not predicated by a deep as possible understanding, of those biases, we're in dilettante space. And so to have that, even when I ask people how many thought traps are there, like the whole of cognitive behavior therapy is just revolving around 5 well-established thinking traps: catastrophizing, black and white thinking, should statements, could statements, overgeneralizing. So if that's the case, and jumping to conclusions, so they are the 5 well-established thinking traps. Most people understand catastrophizing, that some people magnify threat like wacko, and it flips everybody out, and it can be useful if you're an analyst, not that great beyond that. So, but in order to, so my bottom line takeaway is this, Ari. If people can't name their 5 top biases, including their own, and they can't tell you the 5 thinking traps, man, to then put a weighting on that, to align that, is very tricky. Yeah. And you can teach it in 5 minutes, like I hope I've just done. Yes. So after 5 minutes, anybody on the planet can know their 5 biases, put confirmation bias at the top, and then 5 thinking traps. Don't catastrophize. Don't think simplistically in black and white. Don't overgeneralize. Don't jump to conclusions. And don't be, should be, could be. It's like, hey, what can I be? That didn't take that long, and yet. My view is that's the problem with neuroscience. There's so much information, Ari, and that's why we operate as integrationists. There's so much information, and people can jump at little small things. And, I coined a term a long time ago. It was more for my own bemusement. I called it neural epicentrism. Everybody believes that what they're doing at their level, that's the epicenter. Mm-hmm. And everybody else, it's like, if they're doing, say, behavior therapy, and they look at geneticists, they go, oh, that's too simplistic. And then I speak to the geneticists and they say, oh, those neuroimaging people, oh, that's just so superficial. And then you realize that every level has their own biases, because we want a bias that says that what we do is the epicenter. And so it's hard to reconcile all of that in answer to a long answer to your short question.
Yeah, it was a great answer. And, you just made me think of the famous saying, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Oh, totally. I have to tell you that, Ari, my wife often tells me that. She says, you have a bias where every problem you think is a brain hammer. And I go, yeah, but in my case it is. Anyway, she's never been convinced.
On the topic of cognitive bias.
That's my convincing bias, and I'm sticking to it, Ari.
I have to say also, I think there's a skill element to this too, which is, it's not just the intellectual knowing of the biases, you have to implement them. And I run a Facebook group. I have thousands of members in my Facebook group. I see people debating, especially right now, around coronavirus stuff, and the amount of confirmation bias, the amount of poor argumentation fallacies, logical fallacies in argumentation, and the amount of people who just want to rationalize all their preconceived notions and just are not thinking very clearly is amazing to observe. Also on my personal Facebook page among friends, seeing and engaging in lots of arguments. I spent many years in my mid-20s engaging in online forums, in online debates, especially on health-related topics, science-related topics, and with some very, very, very intelligent people. And in the initial part of that, I got hammered pretty good by people who were older and wiser and, more skilled in argumentation than I was. But after years of doing this for many, many hours a day, I learned to become very good at the art of debate, and I learned to be able to see other people's logical fallacies and cognitive biases, and to be able to expose them, and also to, very importantly, be able to see those things in myself. And I think there's a skill element there that I learned over many years of engaging in that I think most people don't have. They don't have, 8 hours a day for 5 years of engaging in these sorts of debates to learn this. So I think just people not being able to see through their own logical fallacies and cognitive biases is a huge, huge problem. And right now there's a war of information taking place, and people on both sides of it. I think politics matters, whether you're left or right. But there's all these specific things, right? There's what's the death rate and the lethality of the virus? Is it 5%, 3.4%, or is it 0.1%? And, you know, very early on, there were people who kind of took sides on that and then decided they were going to have, you know, one thing or the other. It was lockdowns, and you were either pro lockdown and saving lives, or if you were opposed to that, then you were, you know, a demon who was concerned with the economy and money over saving lives. And there was outrage if you were anti-lockdowns. Turns out, you know, there's a whole bunch of arguments that should have happened around what are the health consequences of unemployment and deaths of despair. And, you know, all of those things should have been getting juxtaposed in a rational way. You know, Bill Gates, is he an evil psychopath, or is he, you know, a loving altruist who's saving billions of lives? Should we wear masks? You can find data showing that masks are, you know, are going to save all these lives based on so projection, and other data showing that masks are totally worthless, right? So all these different things where we have all these just completely contradictory data points and narratives and opinions from experts. And then there's this war of information, and then you have people taking sides with all of this information and very convinced, kind of as you were alluding to, their way of thinking is the correct way. Everybody who doesn't think that way is a dummy. And then you just have these battles of people who are in totally different realities. So this is how I'm, you know, kind of understanding what's going on, but I'm really curious what your take on all of that is from a neuroscience perspective.
Yeah, well, that's a great observational perspective of the state of the planet, but and it's really well articulated. And in fact, I'm so glad you raised 2 points. So one is you raised the point about our personal clarity to start before we dialogue with anybody about what we think that means for others. I think if we don't have that clarity for ourselves, it's tricky. So I really liked your example. So when I've looked at you present on camera and the way you beautifully summarize information, and also I can hear you've trained yourself, your voice tonality, the way you argue is like super sophisticated. So that's phenomenal. But you and I know that until that has been integrated fully, that I'm just giving the analogy, right, Ari, that you have you know your biases, you know your thinking traps, and you really thought and worked hard about your most effective integration, alignment is the word I use, between the two. You'll be less powerful than if you do all those amazing things that you do and put it together. And I obviously know that you've put it together, you know, the same as I've seen with John, my friend, our mutual friend, John Asura. It doesn't come overnight. I think a lot of that comes with discipline, though, with the context of seeing the big picture, this alignment. Now, so let's just say we all agree on that. Now, what happens when that misalignment is not there? And I get involved in a lot of these kind of debates and am unnerved by the extent to which that polarity exists in the way you've described. So what is the, you know, people keep saying to me, well, what's the solution? I don't know the solution, but I do know this. I call it the pink elephant effect. If I tell you not to think about a pink elephant, it's impossible for you not to. And in fact, you may never see an elephant again without remembering this conversation. In some little dark recesses of your non-conscious brain, you may see pink elephants again for the rest of your life, and I apologize for that. But the fact of the matter is that the pink elephant effect is what is challenged the planet, because it opened the door to essentially false narratives. Because if you say something, anything, strongly enough, repeat it enough, there's enough pink elephants in there where they start wiring together, and you have got an alternative dialogue going on in your non-conscious brain. And in fact, even if you know it's not true, and I say it to you, you're still going to worry that there's some, you know, the smoke, where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, we all know that most of the time where there's smoke, there's absolutely no fire. So what am I really saying? What I'm saying is this: there's a massive confound that occurs where people who, as you say, can articulate well are very able to give the buttons that fear the brain into taking one side or another. Priming is everything. It's like cues. It's like voice tonality. I can change the tonality of this discussion simply by being a false bullshit artist and slowing down and pretending that I've got some Moses from the Mount wisdom. And if I say it slowly enough with my FM DJ voice, you're more likely to think, hey, this guy's actually for real.
What's FM DJ, just out of
The
curiosity?
FM DJ, you know, the late night FM DJs
Oh, yeah, yeah,
on
yeah.
the radio, they go,
Radio
oh,
DJ. Okay, yeah, yeah.
let's go, let's be calm.
I thought it was all one thing. FM DJ
No,
was some kind of
FMD, my late night
low
FM DJ
profanity
voice.
or something.
Now, I just believe that the brain sees through that stuff because authenticity matters. But you can swing things one way or another by priming. So here's my point. What is the main priming that seems to occur in these debates? So as you know, you've probably seen there's a documentary that's been taken off the web hundreds of times but keeps reappearing about exactly the issues you've discussed, where there's a woman, I'm not going to even mention her name, but where she starts off very cleverly by saying, the state of the health industry, what a bunch of nightmares, what a bunch of, this is crazy, the price gouging. Then we've got all the pharma industry, that's, it's an industrial complex. All things that are true, it is not okay what's going on. The industrial complex is a little bit out of control. And then you can pick up individuals who've made a lot of money from price gouging. So you layer the basic tonality, the priming, with some hot button, non-conscious pink elephants that come roaring through with big tusks. And you go, oh yeah, that is so true. What a disgraceful landscape. Then you ping in what you really want to say, which is, that Gauchi, he's sitting on a vaccine. He's going to become a billionaire from selling it. Like, seriously, people? Seriously, dude, as they used to say. I'm old enough to remember the seriously, dude phases in the 1980s. But there you are, Ari. So when you conflate some aspect of reality, but that trigger fear and put people into that defensive mode, then you hit a confirmation bias set of magnified, distorted facts that lack context. You can say anything and people can sort of go, yeah, that's highly possible. So that's where the confirmation bias and dealing with it. So the only way that we can deal with it is, one, be aware that our brains are super easily hijacked by non-conscious pink elephants of many persuasions. Two, that if we do not train ourselves to deal with probability and context, we will be sheep in the wilderness forever. And that is it's a very personal bias view, as you've heard from my tonality of my answer, but that's all I got.
Yeah. So I want to
does that answer your question firstly?
It does, yeah. I want to dig into some specifics. The way I understand, so I think what you're getting at here is there's an alternative narrative, and I know what documentary you're referring to, and certain views that are being promoted in that are very contrary and contradictory to the mainstream narrative that we're hearing from government authorities, from the WHO, from Bill Gates, and so on. So as I understand it, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree, but I think the best way to look at something like this is a spectrum. To what degree are you cognitively biased in the direction of, on one end of the spectrum, blind trust in authority, and whoever's in a position of power, you just believe whatever they say, versus the opposite, versus complete distrust in authority, and whatever authority says, you think there's some ulterior motive, you think that's a conspiracy, you take nothing at face value, you think everybody in positions of power are evil. And the question is, I hope we can agree that both of those are very flawed, or potentially flawed. The question is, where do you land in the middle, and how do you evaluate where to land on that spectrum, and where's the best place that's in touch with reality? And I want to give one specific example, a couple examples actually. One is Ben Goldacre, who's an MD who's been instrumental in exposing bad science and corrupt science. So the file drawer effect, the fact that thousands of studies that are, for example, funded by pharmaceutical companies never see the light of day if they don't support they don't have a flattering finding towards whatever drug is being studied. It's also true that funding of studies from pharmaceutical companies have a 400% greater likelihood of finding a flattering finding on a particular drug compared to independent research. And then I want to specifically give the example of, back in the, I don't know if it was the 1940s, 1950s, there were ads all over the place on TV and magazines and newspapers of a doctor, an MD, smoking cigarettes and saying how great they are for your health and controlling your appetite. So at the time, if somebody was a quote unquote conspiracy theorist, and they would have said, hey, this is a conspiracy, these authorities have it wrong, really cigarettes are bad for you, people with pro-authority bias would have said, no, you're just a crazy conspiracy theorist. Of course, cigarettes are good for you. Look, the good doctor is telling us they're good for you. Who are you not to trust him, right?
Yeah,
So,
good example.
So how do you, for people who are either inclined towards conspiracy theory in general, or either inclined to assume anybody who goes against the official narrative is automatically wrong, how do you kind of piece that together?
It's a great question and a great example, by the way, with doctors. So let me tell you about two fields that I actually know something about, that I'm actually personally involved at quite a reasonable level. And let me give you my two concrete examples. But firstly, your answer to the question, I don't know, as I say, I don't have solutions, but I just have what I see. And that is that the answer, I think, is to ask yourself the open question is, have I fulfilled my biases? Have I factored those? And then, have I put this into the correct context? Because to me, context and probability are everything. So that's just my point. We can find better balance through context. And context is what you said right at the beginning, the weighting. So let me give you my two examples, Ari, of analogous to yours, but these are two that I've been involved in quite a lot. So if you take antidepressive medication, there's a huge review that's shown that actually they don't really beat placebos by much, like by 10%. And that's a big problem. And so for pharmaceutical companies to be selling a drug like an antidepressive and saying that it's a blockbuster is not okay. And it is surprising to me that to this day, there is not a single test that can predict treatment response in psychiatry. Now, it turns out that my group have done the first study to predict treatment response in depression, and that we're currently in discussion with the FDA to do that. It was a very difficult study to do. It was an $18 million study with 1,700 patients with depression. And the reason is this, that yes, the antidepressives are not, there's tremendous challenges. But as somebody who has a medical and a science background, I do know that there are many people with depression who, if you get the right antidepressive to them, in the right time, at the right time, it can be life-changing and life-saving. So there's an example whereby, yes, the blanket overarching pink elephant effect is big pharma are completely overreaching, and they are. And there's no reason for them not having tests, personalized tests, because they should. And we've already demonstrated that they can. So there's an example where the answer is, however, when you look to the level down and say, well, okay, this is not working as a blockbuster for everything, and nor should it be prescribed or overprescribed. But who is it helping? And where are the situations where it does work? Now, let me please allow me to finish the converse. I have many, many friends and collaborators in the so-called alternative medicine world. And I personally am somebody, as much as I'm a warrior for fighting for drug tests, I do not believe that drugs should be the first order of choice. And I think it's a lot of people like yourself, like John, like Daniel Amen, have been super important to give people alternatives. Heidi Hanna from American Institute of Stress and Synergy Wellness. These are people who are giving alternatives to stratify and personalize and give people alternatives through breath, through meditation, through online cognitive behavior training, through various behavior trainings, through eating and exercise and all the things that you know about only too well that are super important alternatives. Here's the point. When I speak at conferences where people are from the alternative, so-called, I think it's exactly as you say, it's one continuum. There's no alternative. It just should be stratified and personalized. To my absolute horror, and I say horror with a capital H, I have seen the ignorance about the placebo effect. And when I challenge people on that, like I gave a plenary discussion talk at the American Neurofeedback Society, and I said, this is a passion of mine, is brain training, you know, through electrical brain training. It's not invasive. Why would we not do this? But the science, the quality of the science is so bad and so unreplicated that it's taken one of the most powerful treatments we have and just not done justice to it. So when I raised that at this conference, there were hundreds of people there, I said, the only thing missing from this field is quality replicated science. And you know what most people said? We don't have time to do that. Like, we are busy clinicians saving people's lives. So all I'm saying is bias is a strange thing, Ari. And until we all integrate our views and just then look at the layer down, where is neurofeedback helpful? Where can, you know, I'm a vegan. I know that can change people's lives, like seriously change people's health. I personally, I'm having trouble, you know, persuading my son and daughter to get my grandchildren to be vegans because they go, oh God, Dad, not another shtick from you, you know, you've given us this all our lives, enough already. And I go, no, seriously. And so, of course, when you tell people what to do, they have a non-conscious pushback, and it takes years to get to the next phase. So that's my point, Ari, that I think looking below the hood of our biases and finding pragmatic, contextualized, horses for courses, what works, in whom, at what stage, and stratified, I personally have seen works most effectively. So that's my answer to your context about bias is a strange thing and it operates across the board. And I think there are ways of deconstructing it.
Yeah. So I want to interject a couple specific, like, personal stories actually related to the documentary that you brought up recently. I have a very diverse array of friends, a lot of friends who are in the natural health community, functional medicine doctors, MDs, people who are more into natural health, nutrition, and lifestyle factors, and so on. And I also have quite a number of friends who are conventional medical doctors. It's very interesting for me to observe how they react differently to something like the documentary that you brought up. On the one hand, you have a lot of people in the natural health community, less so the scientifically literate ones, but who just immediately assume everything's true. And they're just like, they just take everything in as truth without questioning any of it. And then on the other end, you have a lot of my conventional medical doctor friends who are not at all educated on natural health or nutrition and things like that, who they look at something like this and they just say, oh, this is all total nonsense. None of this is true. And I've seen a number of attempts to, like, kind of rebut or debunk it. And there are certain specific points that are interesting. So, and I want to keep this about cognitive biases, but I just want to mention a couple stories. So one is the immediate assumption that flu vaccines, by my conventional MD friends, the immediate assumption that flu vaccines couldn't possibly have any relationship to coronavirus immunity or could interfere with it. And the reality is there's at least 2, if not 3 studies that have directly tested that, and they have shown about a 35-36% interference with decreased immunity to coronavirus, not specifically SARS-CoV-2, but my point is that there is actually scientific evidence that supports that is at least plausible, if not, very likely. And yet there was an immediate assumption to completely dismiss it as conspiracy theory nonsense. Alternatively, I said, and I pointed that out to them, and they looked at the research, and to their credit, they said, yeah, you're right. I guess I shouldn't have brushed that off so quickly. And I said, here's a quote from Bill Gates. He said, "We cannot get back to normal until we have a vaccine." And I said, what is the evidence to support this claim? As far as I can tell, there has never been a case in human history where we've gone into lockdown in response to a virus and where a vaccine was the reason that we were able to get back to normal. And in fact, from what I can see, there's thousands of viruses that have circulated throughout human history, and many have killed lots and lots of people. And we've always gotten back to normal without a vaccine. So why is it that you accept one of these statements totally uncritically, as if it's based on science, when it doesn't have good evidence, and the other one that actually does have good evidence, you immediately dismissed it as nonsense and quackery and pseudoscience? So, and people on both sides are doing this. I'm giving you one example. There's absolutely a lot of the same thing happening on the other side, of dismissing things that have good evidence as nonsense and dismissing things that don't, and taking in things that don't have evidence totally uncritically. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. I thought my personal anecdote.
Yeah, no, that's great. A great summary, Ari. So I'll tell you what my takeaway from all of this stuff is, and it comes back to, I'm sure you read the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's such a great book that really captures this. Can we reconcile these But that book was fascinating because when the book Nudge was written, which was kind of inspired a little bit by Daniel Kahneman, it was more about these bigger picture issues. How do we deal with it? Anyway, my point is this: even in Daniel Kahneman, here's this guy who really understood the non-conscious and conscious brain and showed the way that these random little nudges to the non-conscious brain can influence our answers quite dramatically. Just how sensitive the non-conscious brain is, that it can even be shaped, nudged by random things that you see. You see a big number and you go, answer's going to be bigger than if you didn't. I mean, seriously, that is amazing. So it just shows how nuanced this is. But the point that I think he made that was so intriguing to me, he was one of the people actually who said, he said, he's one of the greatest statisticians on the planet. And he said he has trouble dealing with his confirmation bias, because it is what it is, a non-conscious confirmation bias. So to me, the issue is this. So he wrote, and many other people like him have written, well, what do we actually do with the example, whether it's that video or whether it's just any information about the coronavirus, any? And to me, it comes back to that simple point that he made and others have made. Firstly, do not believe anything in science that's not replicated. So that's number one. And that is a really basic rule. You know, somebody who's been through the science track and the medical track, I cannot tell you how hard it is for people to live by that, because there is no science without replication. In fact, people forget that when you have a study, it's meaningless till it's replicated, in the sense that you just don't know. It could be random effects, there could be placebo effects. Was it properly replicated? So that's number one. And secondly, never believe anything that is not got big numbers, because we know that with small numbers of surveys or whatever, you can find anything. In fact, there's an old joke in statistics that if you flog your data hard enough, it'll confess to anything. And I really do believe that. So my point is, Ari, the simple discipline of just checking the facts and putting them into context. So let's take that little documentary. When I watched the documentary, I said, hey, this woman is really smart. She's given some really plausible, very negative, but very, certainly I agree with them, statements about the state of healthcare and the way it's controlled by the medical and pharmaceutical industry in ways that are not the healthiest on the planet. So already I'm agreeing with her. But that had nothing to do with what she was saying. She was making very specific things. So here's my point. Over a cup of coffee, it did not take me long to go and look at some of the most basic information that she had put out there, which was this. I mean, I'll just give you one example. The interviewer, priming is everything, just like you primed me. How do your audiences know that I founded the world's first standardized international database? Who knows? Check it out. If you can't see Dr. Evian Gordon and that he's done this, well, it's what is anything I'm saying matter? I just went and looked up. That guy who interviewed her was a masterful priming interviewer. That is not what an interviewer should be. He said, to start, she is one of the most influential, and he said it in his late night FM DJ voice. She is one of the most influential scientists of our time. Seriously? She was one of the people, and this was the point I checked, that had a major impact on the AIDS virus solution. Well, it's very easy to look up. Go look up what impact did she have on contributing to the AIDS virus solution? And the answer is not much. So my point is, you start from there, and every one of the key elements, and then you also, you know, I always am fascinated by people who just published a book. Suddenly they got a book out and they've got a shtick that is hot, button pushing, and selective. And so I'm just saying, how different is that to the pharma industry? How different is that to any marketing spiel? And so it's not that difficult to deconstruct. Now, sometimes what people say, serious whistleblowers, like the smoking ones, turned out to be 100% true, and scarily so. And even to today, there are people who still can try and pull the wings of that butterfly and go, well, you know, cancer, how come my uncle lived and he was 100, he smoked 100 cigarettes a day and didn't get cancer? That's where the probability piece comes in, of knowing how probabilities work. So I'm not saying I've got the answer, as I said, Ari, but I do believe as an integrationist, which is all I'm sharing with you today, that it's actually complicated, but not that complicated. And there are some simple things that I think can cut through and give us a better alignment between the non-conscious biases and the conscious rational thinking that is so powerful that we do have. That's essentially the essence of what I've learned, Ari. And that's it, really. That's pretty much all I got.
And do you have to run right now?
No, I'm just saying that just in case you think I'm trying to drag out my answer. That's it. Like that's that's my answer. Best as I can give it.
I have like 9 more minutes if you can spare.
Yeah, I have a few more minutes.
Okay. Yeah. I think the key, if I'm interpreting you correctly, is be critical of information that you're encountering. Be skeptical of it and check the evidence, and also maybe be extra skeptical and critical of information that meshes with your preconceived notions and what you wish to believe, and go out of your way to do the opposite of what we are naturally inclined to do, which is to take in that information without questioning it, but make an intentional point to question the things which you're inclined to believe or you wish to believe. Is that, you know?
Yeah, that's spot on. Oh, you know, people often ask me this, Ari. They go, okay, we got that. Non-conscious brain, conscious alarm. That's tricky. That's hard. Tell us one thing we can do. And if there's one thing, I just say the same thing. Start off by looking at what's replicated in large studies. Just start off. I mean, there's lots of them out there. You can go to all sorts of places. You can just simply look at, you know, the Cochrane studies. I mean, there are big meta-analyses of things that give you a start. They're not necessarily infallible, but start off with big studies that have replicated. That's the start. And that cleans up so much stuff. And it also often provides a nice context to start. It doesn't always have the answer, but it's a good starting point. So that's always been my starting point.
I completely agree with you. And that's why I really prefer to deal with areas where we have strong evidence and we can just look to the evidence, and it's just a question of how deep are you willing to analyze it and how fairly are you going to take it in and represent that information.
But I do have just a second context about that, which is that I'm an innovator. What I do for a living is find new ways that work in the brain. So there's some things where there is no evidence, but then just say it. Like say, look, Ari, I believe that we can train our non-conscious brain, and here's how. I haven't no proof for this. I haven't done replicated studies, but then I will say to you, Ari, this is my personal view based on my insights from 300 publications from the world's biggest brain database, and having been born at a time where some of the world's innovators in neuroscience, founders of neuroscience, shared stuff magnanimously with me, I can say, this is my view of a distillation, and just share that as a view. So my only other second point, Ari, is to make clear the difference between validated, replicated information and personal intuition that we're discussing and exploring that could be super helpful to people in some cases. So sorry, I just wanted to make that other point about your continuum. It is about having a clear continuum from that replication to what is it. And often people conflate those two. They talk about their personal neural epicentric views as if they validated, replicated examples. And that's another point of conflation that confuses people. Sorry, I cut you off. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to finish that thought.
That was perfect. And that was actually where I'm going with this. So on one end of the spectrum, you have very clear evidence, lots of evidence. It's been repeated. And the challenge is just to learn it and then represent it fairly and accept that the evidence is there and it's strong, regardless of what you want to believe or don't believe, want to believe. The evidence is what the evidence is. But, and I really like dealing with that kind of stuff. But the challenge here is we have things like lockdowns. And I'm just going to give a few examples, like lockdowns. As far as I know, there's only one example in history where we've done lockdowns. It was the 1918 flu pandemic, and social distancing. And there's some retrospective analysis and estimates of how well it might have contributed to reduce death rates. But mostly what it does is spread out the same number of infections over a longer period of time. It doesn't massively reduce the total number of infections, which this is a point that there was widespread misunderstanding on. But my point is there isn't very good evidence on the subject of, do lockdowns save lives or not lives, or don't save lives? And what are the, do they save lives or not save lives when contrasted with all of the fallout from unemployment and deaths of despair and suicides and drug abuse and all the morbidity and mortality that results from the lockdowns? And it's a real question. We don't have like 10 previous pandemics where we can get clear data from. And so there's people using unclear data to try and decide something like that. There's also, I'll give you one more example, the masks. There's a mandate in California where I live to wear masks whenever you're outdoors right now. And you go and look at the evidence, and there's some evidence that you can find in certain contexts saying, you know, masks reduce the risk of infections and block viral particles and things like that. And then there's other studies that have shown, especially with cloth masks, like homemade masks, they may actually increase the risk of infection. And so you can find evidence to support, you know, the idea that masks are either going to save lots of lives or masks may be totally counterproductive. And we don't have really amazing evidence. Even the WHO, the World Health Organization, came out, and I saw an article published from CNN a few days ago saying, there is no evidence to indicate, and this is a quote, there is no evidence to indicate any potential benefit of widespread mask wearing in the general population, as contrasted to like in an acute medical setting. So we're getting just massive conflicting information where we don't have really good data. My goals of this interview are really threefold. One, I want people to understand how to think about things better and how to overcome their cognitive biases. The second thing is I want people to be able to bridge the gap with one another and understand why we're operating in such different realities in many cases, and hopefully be able to communicate in productive ways. And then third of all, and maybe you can speak to this to wrap up, how can we get our brains out of this hijack mode to reset, and so we can use our total brain, in your words, in a productive way instead of allowing this hijack to go on where we're not using our brains very well?
Yeah, so firstly, Ari, thank you for such thoughtful insights and comments and context, and that's really what's needed. So to me, one of the things that I hope people can share with us in terms of looking at data differently, because there are some things that do matter. I know for me, as somebody who's 67, and my friends on the front line who tell me about what it's like when you're intubating someone on a ventilator, it's not fun, you know. So to me, I'm looking at the data about what can I do, you know, and there are little things starting to creep in, like they're doing plasma now, they're extracting antibodies, you know, you can get a CPAP machine rather than a ventilator maybe, but who knows? I'm just saying, we know that the malaria drug probably was a little overstated. The data seems to show that, but the other drugs, there's 150 groups working on vaccines. I mean, so there is evidence. So it's a matter of just taking this replicated data approach, big numbers, and separating the signal from the noise. And that's what we can do. I think the trickier part, Ari, is when we're looking at things that are not just science-based, it's a lot to do with dynamics of trade-offs between economics and health. And that is a different ballgame. Like, that's a whole different level of complexity when we're trying to trade off, you know, it's like stratifying in personalized medicine. Look how many years, I know when I was a medical student, we spoke about holistic medicine. Holistic medicine's not here yet. We haven't managed to even reconcile all of this in the simple, obvious, stratified, step-by-step way. So to do that with something as complicated as the economy versus death rates, whoa, good luck on that one. And it's tough, and we need big, serious modelers who can factor all this in and not pink elephants to be run wild all over the place, scaring everybody to pieces. So that's a tougher thing, but there's a lot of things we can bring that kind of alignment between non-conscious and conscious abilities too. And then there's some things where it's just opinion, really. That's my point about where is it opinion. You know, the economists are not even able to model that kind of stuff yet effectively, you know, where it's really scientifically controlling all the variables that we can see where the right trade-offs are for lockdown versus non-lockdown. That's really, really complicated. There is no precedence to that. And I have no idea what the answer is, but I do know that there's some things we are getting better at. We're getting more and more empowered. And lastly, Ari, I know we've run out of time, but lastly, I'd say that from our data, we give a monthly report of the cognitive data, because we have about 1 million people around the country who've used this, our assessment and stuff. And we can see in the 40 corporates we deal with around the country, the employees, we can see that obviously the anxiety has gone up massively. So has negativity, and so has a lack of focus. And then, of course, the increases in depression and increasingly in addiction. But just to take the example of negativity and focus, negativity can be trained. We know that there are non-drug related ways to retrain ourselves, better brain networks, to prime ourselves to see what is working for us and magnify that rather than the threat. So that is one. And same with focus. You know, as you know, focus is about task completion. And if we do it in small steps and we do what we can do and we connect the dots to get a solution, we can retrain ourselves. And that to me is where people are reaching out for solutions that are simple and natural and straightforward, and they exist, and there are lots of apps on the web, and those can be helpful too. But the greatest help, I think, is having the right framework. And that framework, if it's brain-based, my biased brain hammer view, Ari, is that it works.
If you were going to leave people with one brief piece of wisdom as far as how to regain control of their brain right now amidst all of this war of information, confusing, contradictory data points, what's the single most important thing that people should do right now?
I guess my personal view, which is all it is to reframe. To reframe the issue as an immediate acute danger, hijack, which it is, but also we're already entering into the medium term and starting to be able to think about the long-term solutions. So if you reframe it in terms of time and put solutions down on a piece of paper or in your mind in a clear way of reframing the reality that it's okay to be scared right now. In fact, if you're not, it's a little bit of a worry because there's enough to be scared about, but put it into context and then start thinking about what can I do to restructure. There is going to be a new normal in some way, and how can I prepare for that? How can I now deploy my 85 billion neurons in a way that better aligns my non-conscious and conscious brain, and then start thinking at the long-term solution. Many people are reinventing themselves now because it's the last thing I'll end off with is, Ari, as you know, yes, fear is the greatest hijack, but one thing we know about behavior change, it is also the greatest opportunity where people do change. And that's what I think the opportunity really is. And it's not a platitude, it's for real. This is an opportunity for people to reinvent themselves or reshape their neural networks and rewire brain habits where they can choose who they want to be. For real, like this is an incredible opportunity in that regard. May sound a bit too optimistic, but that's my thoughts.
Yeah, beautiful. Great piece of wisdom to end with. Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with my audience. This has been a lot of fun. For people who are interested in learning more about your work, where's the best place to do that?
So there's a free trial of, if they want to just assess their brains and train with some tools and stuff, at www.totalbrain.com/try, TRY. And I have a podcast called the Total Brain Podcast. And I bring in key opinion leaders to talk about some of these issues. And last but not least, Ari, I want to thank you for the very thoughtful and expansive and yet pragmatic way that you have asked these questions, and that I'm seeing more and more in terms of what you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for saying that. I will admit I was nervous going into this because it's so polarized and emotionally charged out there. I really wanted to be as objective and neutral and present both sides fairly and not get anybody worked up or outraged about anything, and hopefully help people understand how their own brains work and bridge the gap with one another more effectively. And I think you did that brilliantly. So thank you so much again, Dr. Gordon. And
great pleasure. Thanks, Ari.
I hope we can connect again very
And
soon.
I'm looking forward to you being on the Total Brain podcast.
Yeah, me too.
Looking
Yeah,
forward
great
to
to
it.
connect with you. Talk to you soon.
I look forward to it. Look.
Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.